The summer of 1985 was shaping up as the hottest in Los Angeles for 100 years. As night fell, the city struggled to sleep in the stifling heat. But that sleep was soon to be disturbed by a more menacing force. Within months, 13 people would be dead. 5 more would have narrowly escaped with their lives, and a dozen would have endured horrific sexual assaults. A trail of murder and brutality left by the Night Stalker, one of the most ferocious serial killers in the annals of crime history. In the midst of the carnage, Los Angeles homicide detective Gil Carrillo was the first to recognize that a serial killer was stalking the city, and his quest to stop the killings threatened to tear his own life apart. March 17th, 1985. As Maria Hernandez was driving home from a night out with friends, she was oblivious to the car following her. Later that same night, a young lawyer, Veronica Yu, decided she would have to stop her car and try to shake off the man following her. It was a fateful decision.
What are you doing? Why are you following me?
Oh, I wasn't. I just thought I knew you.
You don't know me! I'm calling for the police! Leave me alone, please! No!
Pinche puta.
A trail of terror had begun, and one man was responsible, Richard Ramirez. He had moved to Los Angeles a few years back from the small town of El Paso in Texas. The son of a Mexican policeman, he lived the life of a loner, hanging around sleaze pits and squalid hotel rooms, getting high on cocaine. Richard's early 20s had been dominated by an obsession with Satanism, which he later said was fueled by heavy metal music in which he found hidden demonic messages. Alone in LA, he retreated into a dark world of fantasy, a world of domination, cruelty, and intense sadistic sexual encounters. That spring, something inside Richard Ramirez snapped. His cravings could no longer be satisfied by fantasies alone. The hunt for Richard Ramirez would take many months and plunge all those involved into a world of terror. One man who got to know this case from the inside is author Gil Carrillo. Along with Detective Gil Carrillo, Carrillo ate, drank, and slept with the Night Stalker case for 3 years.
Richard Ramirez entered people's souls, entered people's minds. He was a living, breathing nightmare. He was all our fears come true.
For Deputy Gil Carrillo, the nightmare began late that evening in March 1985. At 34, he was the homicide squad's youngest member, but had already worked on over 100 murder cases.
Gil was in bed. It was a Sunday night. He reluctantly climbed out of bed, not having any idea about the nightmare he was about to enter.
We got 2 victims here, both female. First one's Maria Hernandez, 20 years old. She's at the Beverly. The next one's the roommate, Dale Okazaki. She's 34, didn't make it.
What about Hernandez? Look like is she gonna make it?
Yeah, she's in stable condition over at
Hi, guys.
Yeah, lucky girl.
Why's that?
Housekey deflected the bullet, saved her life probably.
It's pretty damn lucky.
Yeah.
By a freak stroke of luck, Maria Hernandez's life had been saved by the keys she held in her hand. Her roommate, Dale Okazaki, had not been so fortunate. The killer had spotted her hiding behind a kitchen counter. He'd shot her in the forehead.
So this hat, where's this from?
Well, we're pretty sure it's the shooter's hat.
DC, isn't that some heavy metal band or something like that?
Yeah, Highway to Hell. It's a great album.
You say so.
Maria later confirmed that the hat belonged to the killer. This AC/DC hat was to provide a vital clue in the months to come. Maria was also able to help a police artist produce a drawing of her assailant.
All Maria Hernandez could tell Gil was that he wore all black, he had very scary eyes, and he had an odd smell. And Gil said, like, what do you mean an odd smell? You mean like BO? And she said, no, it's a different kind of smell, more like almost a dead body.
Maria is to be one of the very few who saw that face and lived to tell the tale.
Gil was a young Hispanic, brought up in East Los Angeles, which is a tough neighborhood. And Gil could have easily gone in another way in life, but he ended up working as a policeman. He had an uncanny ability to look at a crime scene and know what happened, and had a large degree of what we call street sense. He ended up being made a homicide cop very early on.
Carrillo had only spent 9.5 years as a policeman before being made a homicide detective. It would usually take a minimum of 15 years. He had come to be noticed through his work on Operation Safe Streets, the first plainclothes unit to infiltrate the notorious gangs of East LA.
You guys have 10 minutes. Let's go.
Buenos dias, mommy.
The son of Mexican immigrants, Carrillo had worked hard to provide a comfortable life for his family. In 1985, they were living in a quiet, leafy suburb of East LA.
Ladies, come on, let's go.
You guys better get moving.
I'll pack your lunch. Egg. Hurry.
That March morning, the toughest case in Gil Carrillo's life had just begun, and it would threaten all he held dear before it was over.
May I? Wait here a second. This is from a case that I caught last week. Young girl abducted, restrained with thumb cuffs, sexually assaulted. Look familiar? Yeah, I see your point.
Hey, Gil, I got something new here for you.
As well as the similarity between the two drawings, the ballistics reports from the Okazaki and Yu murders suggested another possible connection. Both bullets were from a .22 caliber revolver and had probably been fired from the same weapon, though the casings were too badly damaged to be absolutely certain.
When he heard that there had been a second shooting that night, Gil didn't think much of it at first, but then he heard that a .22 caliber gun had been used. And something just clicked in his head. And at that point, he was thinking, there might be something going on here that's unusual.
It dawned on Carrillo that he might have a different kind of killer on his hands. If the same person was responsible for the child assaults and the shootings, that pointed to a serial killer. A killer who would continue to kill until he was stopped. Carrillo started searching police records for any mention of suspects dressed in black, who listened to heavy metal and had known sadistic tendencies. Only 8 days after the murder of Dale Okazaki and Veronica Yu, someone broke into the house of Vincent and Maxine Zazzara in the affluent community of Whittier. They were both shot dead. Maxine Zazzara was mutilated, and bizarrely, the killer removed her eyes and took them with him. When Carrillo found out that a .22 caliber gun was used in the Zazzara murders, he was keen to talk to the detectives investigating the case. His suspicion that these recent crimes were connected was further aroused when detectives mentioned that a footprint found at the Zara's house matched one found at yet another child abduction.
May not be the same guy, but definitely the same type of shoe. What was that? Start with an A.
Avia, size 11 and a half. Big foot.
I think you're looking for the same guy. One suspect.
What are you saying? One shoe, one size fits all?
As the youngest member of the homicide squad, Carrillo found it difficult to gain support for his theory.
And he was kind of considered the new kid on the block, and it was hard for him, a little bit difficult for him to get across the point that, hey, I think we're dealing with a serial killer. And what you have to keep in mind is that there are hundreds of murders that happen every year in Los Angeles, and there are dozens, if not hundreds, of investigators. So you don't have the same person going on in the same scene, and it's very difficult even to develop the information that you are dealing with a serial killer because not everybody talks to each other.
Carrillo was convinced that a serial killer was on the loose, but an unusual one. Because unlike most serial killers, this one had no pattern, assaulting and murdering victims with no obvious similarity in age, race, or background. There was one man who he thought would listen to him, someone who knew the territory, someone with direct experience of hunting down serial killers.
What you got?
Frank Salerno is a very unusual man, and he was known as the best homicide man in Los Angeles. When these crimes began, it was interesting how these two guys got together because you had an older, seasoned, hardcore homicide guy and a young, hungry homicide cop.
I'm telling you it's the same guy, Frank. I feel it right here.
You gotta go out there and you gotta do the homework. The guy's a pervert. You go out there and you check every single sex offender that has just gotten out. That's the way you gotta do it.
And Frank was skeptical, but he believed that it's possible. A good homicide man always has an open mind. Frank was the only guy in that office that believed Gil could be on to something.
Frank Salerno was the lead detective, and he was very well respected, very experienced, having been involved in the Hillside strangling case. And Gil was relatively new to homicide at that point in time. So I'm sure it would have meant a lot to Gil to have Frank support whatever theories that he was putting out there.
Although many of his colleagues remained skeptical, because of the evidence of the shoe print and the ballistics, Carrillo managed to convince Salerno that he had a case. A small task force was set up.
We're using red for the murders, these for abductions and for rapes, okay?
As they began to investigate further, Carrillo had an uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach. He felt certain that the killer would strike again, and that he would strike soon. For Richard Ramirez, the act of killing had become the ultimate high, an addiction more potent than anything he'd ever experienced before, and he craved the next fix.
Good night.
You rest well.
Okay.
Have good dreams.
You too.
Good night, dear.
Good night.
The pile of newspapers outside Mabel Bell's door made her gardener Carlos suspicious. He'd been taking care of her yard for years and was worried that the soaring heat of the last few days had taken its toll on the two elderly sisters.
Senora Bell? Senora Bell?
Mabel Bell and her invalid sister Nettie Lang had been tortured, electrocuted, and beaten to death. This time, the killer had the audacity to pause for food and drink before he left.
Gil and Frank were so hoping perhaps there would be a fingerprint on either one of the cans, but there was no prints because he always wore gloves.
Although the killer left no fingerprints, he did leave what would become an identifying mark.
They found a pentagram drawn on the wall, and they found a pentagram on one of the victims' thighs.
The pentagram is a symbol of the occult, associated with satanic worship.
Gil was trying to understand the significance of this pentagram and how it would play into the crimes, and he remembered the AC/DC hat that he found in the Marie Hernandez garage. And he went and asked his daughter about this group, and she said AC/DC was like a bad boy group that were satanic in nature. There was one song in particular called Night Prowler, and it talked about a killer going out and looking in blinds and stalking people, which was exactly what was going on.
Carrillo and his team also found another Avia footprint, this time in blood, on an alarm clock found at the scene.
Jerry, it's from the old lady's place off the alarm clock. I need everything there is to know about this Avia snooper. Everything. And Jerry, I need it yesterday.
I know. I'm on it.
Thanks, buddy.
I was brand new in the physical evidence section. I was working here, and my supervisor brought to me a couple of plaster casts and a clock with a partial shoe print on it, and asked me to compare the evidence from 3 different scenes just to see if the shoe impressions could have been caused by the same shoe. And so I conducted examinations on them, checking for size and overall length and width and things like that. They were trying to find anything they could at that time to link certain cases.
Yeah, hold on.
Carrillo.
A few days after the horrific attack on the 2 old ladies, Carrillo was called out to an attempted break-in in his mother's neighborhood, Pico Rivera.
I'm on my way.
The same Avia footprint had been found. The address was only 3 blocks from his childhood home, where his mother and sister still lived.
Mama, I need you to do something for me right away, okay? I need you to go and lock all the windows in the house and lock the doors too, okay? I'm not trying to scare you, Mama. There's a real bad son of a bitch in the neighborhood, okay? Just do that for me, all right? And I'll see you later. Okay. I love you too.
Knowing the killer had been out stalking in his own neighborhood deeply disturbed Carrillo. The threat was now personal, a menace to all he held dear: his home, his family, his community. And he had no idea when the killer was going to strike again, where he would strike, or why. The next day, LAPD motorcycle officer John Stavros pulled over a man in dark clothing for running a red light. As he was phoning through the man's details, he missed hearing an urgent police radio call. But the man in black didn't.
Attempted abduction. Suspect is a Hispanic male, driving a dark-colored car, maybe armed and dangerous. Please respond.
Richard Ramirez fled before Stavros could connect him with the wanted man. It was a mistake which was to cost the police dearly. May 30th. 42-year-old Carol Kyle was brutally assaulted. She later described her attacker as tall, good-looking, Hispanic, with bad teeth and a pungent body odor. June 27th. 28-year-old Patty Higgins was assaulted and stabbed to death. Her throat cut so deeply, she was almost beheaded. July 2nd. 75-year-old Mary Cannon was beaten and stabbed to death. Her throat slit in the same way as Patty Higgins. Crime scene investigators were starting to detect a pattern. All 3 houses had been ransacked, their phones disabled with the cord ripped out, and they found another shoe print. The pressure was mounting for Carrillo and his team. They felt they were getting nowhere fast.
There's a person out there who's killing innocent people, and you want him to be captured. You want to do everything in your power to be captured, and you're always lying awake at night and saying, what could I do more? You're going over the evidence again and again and again in your mind. You're going over crime scenes, and you're thinking, did I miss anything? Okay, was there anything that could have been done differently?
Despite their best efforts, the killings continued. "16-year-old Whitney Bennett returned to her home in the affluent suburb of Sierra Madre around 1 in the morning. She'd been out celebrating the 4th of July with friends and was late. Her parents had also been out partying, but had returned around midnight and were soundly asleep. The events of that night would change the Bennett family's lives forever.
It was very scary walking into that house, to walk in there and realize that her parents were just down the hall in their bedroom, and here she was in the front room. There was no sign of forced entry, and later we found out that he just came in through the front door to have beaten her as badly as she was beaten and as much as she bled, and then for him to just leave through the bedroom window. It was very scary that someone wasn't seen, no one heard anything.
I heard my daughter moaning. I thought she was sick, and that's all I know.
When Stephen Bennett found his daughter in the early hours of the morning, she'd been beaten with a tire iron, struck more than 20 times. She had 42 separate lacerations to the head. Doctors were astonished that she'd survived.
I hadn't seen that much blood at many crime scenes. I was actually surprised that she lived.
Both Frank and Gil have daughters the same age as this girl was, and it really, really got to them. It really, really struck home. She needed 478 stitches to sew the wounds closed, and she was very close to death. And it affected them very personally. I mean, this is more than just a nameless, faceless person being attacked and dumped in the street somewhere. This guy is entering people's homes in the middle of the night.
It's too small. We'll get you to get the figuring in just a second. Okay, we've got some.
We had found a pile of clothing items and bedding laying between the bed and the closet. And we just decided we were going to go through them because there was so much blood on the carpeting. We thought just in case someone happened to step in it. And we were just moving items of clothing, looking at them front and back. And there was a pink comforter, and sure enough, there was an impression in blood. It was obviously a shoe impression on this pink comforter.
I'm gonna have forensics come down and dust for prints and for the floor for a footprint. Yeah.
Hey guys, I got something you might want to check out.
It was very exciting because that solidified that, yes, in fact, we do have a serial murderer.
Frank, this is our guy.
Let's get it to the lab.
What you got, Jerry? Oh, what we've got is one very exclusive item of footwear.
Do we?
Yes, it appears only 1,345 of the Avia 440s were ever made. Only 6 ever made their way to California. But wait till you hear this. Only one is a size 11 and a half. Our boy is wearing the only pair in LA. One of a kind.
When I found out that there was only one shoe sold in that size in the Los Angeles area, it's very exciting in a sense that we know now that we're dealing with a very unique set of circumstances. And you know that if this person keeps using this shoe, that the cases are going to be easier to link, and it's going to mean more. The evidence is going to be more conclusive.
It was now acknowledged that a ferocious serial killer was loose on the streets of Los Angeles, and that Carrillo had been right all along. All these crimes, all this carnage and suffering was caused by one man. The need to find him became more urgent with each passing hour.
Gentlemen, ladies, Gil was right.
He felt vindicated. He felt that the people that laughed at him and didn't believe him now looked at him in a different way, and they didn't see now an inexperienced guy. They saw somebody who knew what he was talking about. They saw somebody whose instincts were right on the money.
Pursuing the killer was a punishing task. Carrillo and his colleagues were working long days and often overnight, and rarely saw their families.
Good night, guys. See you in a few hours. Get some sleep.
His wife was frightened to be alone. She was complaining to him that he was in the house. You have to understand, he was now working double and triple shifts. He wasn't coming home. She was sleeping alone. They have 3 young children in the house, and she was petrified. And he said he was doing his best, that they were going to get this guy. She was like, Gil, you know, you'll get him, but meanwhile the crimes are continuing. And it kind of angered him, but he understood that she was frightened like everyone else in Los Angeles.
By July, Pearl was often spending nights away from home, staying with friends and in-laws.
And he was kind of bowled over because he's the man of the house. He's a cop. He carries a gun. And here his own wife is telling him she don't want to be in his house.
At that point in time, knowing the types of neighborhoods that the Night Stalker was going into, they were very quiet neighborhoods, not a lot of traffic, but they had good freeway access for somebody to escape. I was starting to personally get very scared. I perceived my neighborhood as one where this person could be lurking around. You have to remember we were going through a heat wave, temperatures 90s, 100s most of the time, so we never opened windows, which didn't sit well with my husband. He said, you don't have to worry, I'm here, and I couldn't. And to this day I can't. I cannot sleep with open windows at night.
July 7th, 63-year-old psychiatric nurse Sophie Dickman was awoken in bed by a man dressed in black. She was beaten and raped. The house was ransacked. As she asked for mercy, her attacker made her swear on Satan. That same night, 61-year-old Joyce Nelson was beaten and strangled to death. It was the 5th attack in little over a week.
One of the theories of forensic science is that you really can't walk into any kind of building or any place without leaving some trace that you'd been there. And it's our job to try to find out what those traces are and what they eventually mean.
We knew to concentrate on shoe impressions, any areas that might retain a shoe impression. And at Joyce Nelson, in fact, there was one.
They found the Avia shoe print on this woman's face. The killer kicked her so hard that he left a permanent imprint on her face. And Frank and Gil are looking at this elderly woman and knowing that it could have been their mother, it could have been anyone's mother, and again, it just turned up the heat.
In those first few scorching weeks of July, the press got wind of the investigation, and now even the police weren't denying it. A serial killer and a brutal rapist was prowling the streets of Los Angeles.
Initially, it wasn't publicized because I think they didn't want to panic people. But at the point in time in July where we had Whitney Bennett, Joyce Nelson, we had Mary Cannon, all within a 2-week period, at that point in time it was released to the media that you have to be careful. You've got to lock your windows and doors. There is a serial murderer out there.
Sometimes they would get a little bit ghoulish because they would be sometimes wait out there for 8-9 hours while you're doing your investigation inside, and you go outside and they ask you, well, when are you going to bring out the body? Because they wanted that shot. The mood of Los Angeles was very pensive, very panicked, and very fearful. It was just almost like a thick cloud that hung in the air at that time.
I said 11 and a half. We're talking a big-footed guy here.
The intense media attention resulted in Carrillo getting a stream of calls from across Southern California, from police officers who thought they might have captured the killer.
Homicide, Carrillo.
There was several frustrating times because they knew they had a serial killer, and it seemed that they were trying to tie every case in the county to that. They were examining every case, every shoe print that came through to see if they were somehow connected.
In the early hours of July 20th, Max and Layla Nighting, aware of the dangerous killer at loose in L.A., thought that they had made their house secure. The couple were both shot to death, but not before their attacker had slashed at them with a machete in an attempt to behead them. And still he was not satisfied, and no one could stop him.
she was able to help construct a very good likeness of the man that raped her and killed her husband. And that sketch was given to every single policeman in Los Angeles County, and they had it on the visor of their car.
News of the latest killing spree pushed the population of Southern California in a greater fear and panic.
Los Angeles County is a huge county, and there are 10 million people in this city alone. He could strike anyone. There were many times when I thought that, he's never going to be captured. I almost became hopeless.
There was panic. People were scared.
Gun shop owners were finding lines of people in front of the stores wanting to buy firearms.
There were not many things that stood in his way that stopped him from getting into homes if that's what he wanted to do.
Everybody wanted extra locks, everybody wanted alarms, everyone wanted extra light because they feared the Night Stalker.
There were cases where he came in through pet doors.
He had the advantage at that time of knowing where he was going to strike next.
The next place the killer chose was Diamond Bar, a suburb near to Gil Carrillo's family home. This proved to be the last straw for his wife, Pearl.
When? Hold on. Okay, go ahead. Uh-huh. Okay.
Where to now?
Diamond Bar.
You're joking. Gil, tell me that you're joking.
You want to see what I wrote on this paper here? It says Diamond Bar. Pearl. Pearl, where are you going?
We are going. The kids.
So, Pearl, you gotta let me do my job.
Gil, we are scared. I'm scared. The kids are scared. Everybody is scared.
Pearl, I'll take you over to my mom's when I get back. Just let me do what I gotta do.
Oh, no, I don't think so. You are going nowhere. You hear me? Nowhere until you make sure that we are safe. Ned is not here.
Pearl, don't do this.
This really upset him. I mean, he was crestfallen because his home life, the thing that he cherished the most, he was losing, literally. Though he knew she was right. And reluctantly, he packed her things in the car and he drove his wife and his 3 children to his in-law's house. And when he saw his father-in-law, it really brought home how helpless he was and how he wasn't doing what he should be doing, which is protecting his own family.
When Gil finally arrived at the Diamond Bar crime scene, he found another woman who'd been raped while her husband lay dying next to her.
When you go to the crime scenes and you see what this person has done, like shooting a husband in the head and while he's sleeping, and then assaulting the wife, right next to the body of her dead or dying husband, it just infuriates you. And there's part of, I guess, the male macho mystique or whatever you want to call it, that almost makes you wish that he would try to break into your house. Instead of attacking innocent women, helpless women, why don't you come after me?
It was hard. The best we could do at that time was to link things. So it was very, very long days. Phone calls from Frank and Gil. Did you find anything new, anything you want to let me know about? Right. And in some instances, waiting for a phone call that he had struck again.
Gil was working 2 and 3 shifts. He was working 20 hours, 24 hours. When he came home, he was bone tired. And he opened the door and the house was empty. His family was gone. And it upset him deeply, profoundly inside. He took to keeping a loaded gun right by the bed, which he never did before. It's a dangerous thing to do because you don't know what you can do when you're in a deep sleep, when you're having a nightmare. wake up in a cold sweat, grab his gun, and search the house thinking the stalker somehow, in some strange way, found out where he lived. At this point, all everybody's talking about is the Night Stalker. The first thing people are talking about over breakfast are these Night Stalker crimes. The last thing people are talking about before they go to sleep are the Night Stalker crimes. And the killer is sensing the heat. He sees that there are a lot more cops that are being a lot more attentive, and he's thinking it's time to maybe make himself scarce in Los Angeles. And he went to San Francisco.
In mid-August, Carrillo and his team were informed of the shooting of an elderly Taiwanese couple, Peter and Barbara Pan, in San Francisco. The house had been ransacked, and on the bedroom wall, written in lipstick, was a pentagram and the words, "Jack the Knife." The Night Stalker was now venturing even further afield, and no Californian felt safe. While the killer was expanding his hunting ground, all the police could do was play catch-up. There was no biological evidence. The only things they had to go on were the bullet casings and the Avia shoe prints.
To try to help the San Francisco cops, they told them about the small caliber gun. They told them about the Avia shoe print. And what they told them slowly passed up the chain of command to Mayor Dianne Feinstein. And she got it in her head to hold a press conference.
The ballistics on the weapons that killed both Mr. and Mrs. Pan are the same ballistics on, I understand, more than a dozen murders committed in Southern California. I've authorized $10,000 for information.
Is that Feinstein?
What was she thinking?
As well as disclosing the police's ballistic evidence, Mayor Feinstein went on to reveal that they were also using the Avia footprint to link suspected Night Stalker cases. While she may have deemed this information to be important to calm a frightened public, her revelations infuriated the investigators.
It was, I suppose, typical of a politician, but it doesn't take a lot of imagination to understand that if you've got evidence that you're building a case against a person who isn't caught yet, you don't let it out.
Once it was released that that's how these cases were being tracked, at that point we stopped seeing the Avia.
The killer saw the press conference, gathered up the guns, got those shoes, put them in a bag, walked out into the Golden Gate Bridge, and he dropped them in the ocean, and they were lost forever.
Just as the police investigation threatened to fall apart, their luck began to change.
A young boy came into play. His name was James Romero. It was his birthday, and he'd been given a bike, and he couldn't sleep. He was in the garage cleaning the bike, and it's late. It's like 12:30 at night. When the killer got off the freeway, he drove down James' block. The moment he was driving past him, James looked up and he saw a man drive by, and for the briefest of moments, this boy locked eyes with the killer. After the Night Stalker passed James Romero's house, he took a left turn, drove 2 blocks, and parked. He entered the home of a sleeping couple. He shot the male, and he dragged the female by her hair into the room, and he told her, "Tell the police that the Night Stalker did this. Tell Frank Salerno and Gil Carrillo that the Night Stalker did this crime."
But as the Night Stalker drove back to the freeway, he was unaware that he was being watched. James Romero seized the opportunity to write down the license number. It was the lucky break that the police had been praying for. As the police searched for the orange vehicle, another vital lead came through. Finally, as August 1985 drew to a close, the web of evidence surrounding the Night Stalker began to tighten.
Is this homicide? This is a guy on the street, and I think I got somebody that you're looking for. I know who he is. The guy that, that guy that's been doing those bad things to people.
When the killer went to San Francisco, as it turned out, it was the beginning of the end for him. A piece of jewelry that he took from the Pan residence, he gave to a fellow burglar that he knew, who in turn gave it to a girlfriend. And the police published photographs of this particular piece of jewelry in the newspaper. These people saw it, they realized there was money in it for them, they ran to the cops, and they said, "We know who the Night Stalker is."
The police were given the name Rick Ramirez. Finally, they had a name for the man who had preyed upon the city for the last 6 months. On entering the names Rick, Richard, or Ricardo Ramirez into their computers, the police discovered that there were vast numbers of them on file. While the task force were trying to narrow down the names, the orange vehicle was found.
That was exhilarating to know that a vehicle had been found and he had slipped up and left a fingerprint impression. And that's what ultimately led to an identification on him.
He was very specific in getting rid of his fingerprints. He didn't want the police to have his fingerprints. But on this night, he adjusted the rearview mirror. And in adjusting the rearview mirror, he left one fingerprint.
When they fed the fingerprint into the computer, it identified one person, Richard Munoz Ramirez, a petty criminal from El Paso, Texas, who had been picked up by the LAPD for a car theft the year before. His police mugshot had been in the system all this time. The Night Stalker had been identified, and the police had to make a critical decision.
There was some question as to whether they wanted to broadcast it over the news, but I think Detective Salerno made the call that, we should broadcast it and we should make it public and just get the public's help in trying to track him down.
And the next morning, that photograph was on the front page of every single newspaper in America.
The only problem was Ramirez had left town days earlier.
And the Saturday morning that all the newspapers came out, he had no idea he'd been identified as the Night Stalker. He, in fact, was coming back into Los Angeles on a bus. Frank Salerno and Gil ordered detectives to be looking for Ramirez to be leaving. Nobody's looking for him to be coming into Los Angeles, and lo and behold, they're looking this way, and he walks right behind them.
Ramirez was returning to a city that he had terrorized for the last 6 months. 13 inhabitants murdered, a dozen brutally assaulted, and the rest of its population living in fear. It was a city that was now familiar with his face and determined to end the nightmare Ramirez had begun.
¿Café?
Sí, un café, sí.
Resurrection.
No, not resurrection. The one with the boat.
Matador.
Policía, el Night Stalker, el matador Ricardo Ramirez está
He ended up on a street called Hubbard Street in East LA, which is a tough neighborhood. And everyone knew on that block that a Hispanic had been identified as the stalker, and they all hated him. They all wanted a piece of him. This fellow gave chase, and soon all his friends, all his neighbors, Ramirez had a mob of angry Mexican men chasing him, looking to do him. And they would have killed him. They were intent upon killing him. And a police car rolled up, and it was the police that saved Richard Ramirez that day.
Back up. Ramirez? Richard Ramirez? Yes, I am. Turn it over. Let's go. Come on.
¡Puto asesino maldito! ¡Vamos, maricón! ¡Te agarramos, pendejo! ¡Suéltate ahora, maricón!
Richard Ramirez was arrested on the last day of August 1985. It would be 3.5 years before he eventually went to trial. But finally, on September 20th, 1989, Ramirez was found guilty of 13 counts of murder and 30 other felonies. He was sentenced to the gas chamber and still awaits his execution.
Relief. We were collecting bloodstains on Hubbard Street, and a helicopter that was doing surveillance photos of the area was circling above us, and they came on over the PA system that in fact the Night Stalker, aka Richard Ramirez, had been captured and he'd been identified. They had him back at a Hollenbeck station, and it was him. It was definitively him. And it was, and the neighbors, the people that were crowding around watching us process the crime scene, started to clap, and everybody was very excited. It was a feeling of relief.
When I asked Gil about how he felt that day, when he got home that night, he started crying. And he told me he felt a vindication, all along he felt responsible for capturing this man. He felt these were crimes that were happening on his beat, on his watch, and he was responsible for bringing this guy down. And he did finally bring him down.
Bizarrely, since his capture, Ramirez has become something of a celebrity, a death row sex symbol. During the trial, he attracted a female fan club who turned up to see him every day in court. Shooting them flirtatious smiles and taunting victims' families with satanic symbols, he never once showed any sign of remorse. In 1996, Ramirez actually married one of his admirers. But back in the summer of 1985, as he shot, slashed, and raped his way across Los Angeles, no woman would have chosen to catch the attention of the Night Stalker.
Was this Satan? Was it a madman? Who is capable of such things? That's what everyone was asking themselves, and there was no answer. And there still is no answer. To this day, nobody really knows why those crimes were committed. What hatred, what anger motivated this man to do these terrible, terrible, terrible things.